The sun was a merciless hammer over the Arizona territory, beating down on the cracked earth until the heat shimmered in waves, distorting the horizon into a watery mirage. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything: the scrubby mesquite, the skeletal ribs of saguaro cacti, and the weary figures shuffling in the heat. At the edge of this desolation stood Bolton's trading post, a festering sore of an outpost where souls were weighed and sold for coin, whiskey, or promises. It was here that Naichi stood, a ghost in a world that had long since tried to erase her. She had been brought in with the morning supply wagon, tied loosely to the back with a rope that had chafed her wrists raw over 3 days of jolting travel. Her feet, clad in worn-out moccasins, were numb from standing. She was the last of the lot, a small collection of native people rounded up after a cavalry raid weeks prior, their spirits as broken as their lives. The others, younger girls with fear still bright in their eyes, or men with muscles fit for hard labor, had been examined and bartered for. But Naichi remained, an unmoving statue of quiet despair. Her black hair, once a source of pride, hung limp and dusty past her shoulders. Her face, a canvas of high cheekbones and a strong jaw, was smudged with dirt and streaked with the memory of tears long since dried. She kept her gaze fixed on the splintered planks of the porch beneath her, a universe of pain contained in that small patch of wood. A man shuffled forward, his breath a foul mix of cheap liquor and rotting teeth. He was old, his back stooped from years of panning for gold in unforgiving streams. His eyes narrowed to greedy slits. He circled Naichi as he would a horse, his grimy hand reaching out to grab her chin, forcing her head up. Her eyes met his, and, for a fleeting moment, the emptiness within them was disturbed by a flicker of cold defiance. It was a look he didn't appreciate. "She's a scrawny thing," he rasped to Jebediah, the portly, sweat-stained proprietor of the post. "But she looks like she could handle a wash tub and a cook fire. How much for this one?" Jebediah mopped his brow with a greasy rag. $10. Silas. And she's tougher than she looks. Apache stock." Silas grunted, his gaze traveling down her body. He poked a finger into her shoulder, then her ribs. Naichi didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that to show pain was to invite more of it. His eyes stopped at her left leg. He ran his hand down her calf, feeling the gnarled ridge of scar tissue beneath the thin fabric of her dress. Years ago, a soldier's horse had trampled her as her people fled. The bone had healed badly, leaving her with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, a constant reminder of the day her world had ended. "What's this?" Silas snarled, his grip tightening. "She's damaged goods. Jebediah, I need a worker, not a cripple to feed." "It's nothing," Jebediah insisted, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. "Just an old break. She gets around fine, I tell you." But Silas had already made up his mind. He shoved Naichi away from him, the unexpected force sending her stumbling. She caught herself before she fell, her body tensing, but her face remained a stoic mask. "You try to cheat me?" the old prospector spat, turning his fury on the proprietor. "Passing off broken stock." Jebediah, seeing a sale slip away and his reputation questioned, turned his own rage upon the easiest target. He grabbed a coiled leather strap from a nail on the porch post. "She's just stubborn," he bellowed, more for the benefit of the other onlookers than for Silas. "Nothing a little persuasion won't fix." The first lash caught Naichi across the back. The sound was a sharp, ugly crack that split the oppressive silence. She gasped, her body jerking, but no scream escaped her lips. She had sealed her sounds away in a place no one could reach. He struck her again, and then a third time, the leather biting into her flesh through the thin dress. Dust puffed up from the fabric with each blow. She staggered forward, her hands bracing against the wooden post, her head bowed. The world swam in a haze of red-hot pain, but she would not give them the satisfaction of her cries. She would give them nothing. It was into this tableau of casual cruelty that Eli Garrison rode. He wasn't a man who belonged in a place like this. There was a quiet decency about him that seemed as out of place as a wildflower in a salt flat. He was young, perhaps 24, with shoulders broadened by hard work and a face that was more earnest than hard. His blue eyes, the color of a pale winter sky, were weary. He rode a sturdy bay gelding, and his saddle, though well used, was well cared for. He dismounted, his movements economical and tired, and tied his horse to the railing, his gaze taking in the scene on the porch with a deepening frown. He had put off this day for as long as he could. The letter from the land office sat in his saddlebag, a constant, damning reminder. The Garrison homestead, secured by his father under the act, required a family to hold the deed. A wife, with his parents gone 2 years now, taken by fever in the same bitter winter. The law saw him as a bachelor squatter, not a homesteader. He had until the end of the season to marry or lose the one thing left in the world that mattered to him, the land his father had bled for. And a place like Bolton's was the only place a man like him, isolated and land poor, could find a wife on such short notice. The thought left a taste like ash in his mouth. He stepped onto the porch just as Jebediah raised the strap for another blow. "That's enough." Eli's voice was low, but it cut through the air with an authority that made the proprietor pause. Jebediah turned, his face flushed and belligerent. "This ain't your business, cowboy. Just a little discipline for some stubborn property." Eli's gaze drifted from Jebediah's cruel face to the silent, trembling figure of the Apache woman. He saw the dust on her back, the rigid line of her spine, the way her hands gripped the post, knuckles white. He didn't say another word, but his stare was unwavering, and in its cold disapproval. Jebediah saw the potential loss of another customer. Grumbling, he tossed the strap aside. "Fine, fine," the proprietor muttered. "What can I do for you, mister?" "Heard a man could find help here," Eli said, the word wife catching in his throat. A greasy smile spread across Jebediah's face, his mood shifting instantly. "You heard right. The finest selection in the territory. Come this way, sir. Come this way." He led Eli past Naiche, who remained frozen by the post, and into the grimy main room of the trading post. A few women sat on a bench along the far wall. They were what the territory called mail-order brides, though most had been brought here under far less formal circumstances. A pale girl from back east, running from a past he could only imagine. A Mexican woman with haunted eyes, probably captured in a border raid. They looked up as he entered, their expressions a pathetic mixture of hope and fear. They tried to sit up straighter, to smooth their worn dresses, to offer a wan smile. Eli felt a pang of pity, so sharp it was almost painful. This was a marketplace of desperation. His eyes scanned their faces, but he felt nothing, no connection, no flicker of recognition. They were all strangers, their tragedies written in the lines around their mouths. His gaze drifted past them, toward the open doorway, to the figure still standing in the brutal sunlight. She hadn't moved. She hadn't even looked his way. She just stood there, a vessel of stillness in a world of noise and pain. "What about that one?" Eli asked, his voice quiet, gesturing with his chin toward the porch. Jebediah followed his gaze and scoffed. "Her? Son, you don't want her. She's Apache. Damaged, too. Got a bad leg. Not worth the trouble." "Let me see her," Eli insisted, his tone leaving no room for argument. With a shrug, Jebediah called Naiche inside. She moved slowly, the slight limp more pronounced now that she was exhausted and in pain. She didn't look at Eli. She stopped a few feet away from him and resumed her study of the floorboards, her presence a void of silence in the room. Eli walked toward her. The other women on the bench watched, their brief flicker of hope extinguished. He stood before her, close enough to see the faint tremor in her hands. He saw the proud line of her nose, the curve of her lips set in a line of grim endurance, and he looked into her eyes. Jebediah had called her stubborn, but Eli saw something else. It was a hollowness. Yes, a profound, soul-deep emptiness that spoke of unimaginable loss. But beneath it, buried deep, was a flicker of something else, a coal, not yet extinguished, a resilience that had survived the fire, even if it no longer burned brightly. He didn't know why, couldn't have explained it to any living soul, but he felt a pull, a strange sense of recognition. He saw a soul as lonely as his own. He made his decision. It wasn't a choice born of logic or desire, but of a sudden, inexplicable impulse, a gut feeling that this was the right and only thing to do. "This one," he said to Jebediah. "I'll take this one." Jebediah's jaw dropped. "The Apache, for a wife? Son, are you sure? There are better, cleaner options." "I'm sure," Eli said, his voice firm. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his belt and counted out the coins. The sound of the metal clinking on the countertop was the sound of a life being sold. He turned back to the woman. He was her owner now. The thought sickened him. He knelt slightly to catch her gaze, to speak to her as a person, not property. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She looked up at him for the first time, her dark eyes unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, her voice, raspy from disuse, emerged in a near inaudible whisper. The words were English, learned in captivity, and they carried the weight of her entire existence. "I ain't worth much," she whispered. The words struck Eli harder than any physical blow. It was a confession of utter brokenness, an assessment of her own value learned through years of abuse. A knot tightened in his chest. He stood up, his jaw set. "You're coming home with me anyway," he said, the words a vow he didn't fully understand himself. The wedding, if one could call it that, was a mockery. The justice of the peace was a rheumy-eyed drunkard whom Jebediah roused from a stupor in a back room. He slurred his way through a few legally required phrases, his breath stinking of whiskey. The ceremony took place on the trading post porch as the sun bled across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and bruised purple. Jebediah served as the witness, a smug, proprietary smirk on his face. No one offered blessings. No one smiled. When the justice pronounced them man and wife, Jebediah let out a short, derisive laugh. Eli signed the marriage certificate, his signature a firm, angry slash of ink. Nietzsche made a simple X, her hand guided by his. The paper was all that stood between him and losing his home. Eli bought a few supplies, flour, salt, beans, and a scrawny mule for Nietzsche to ride. He helped her onto its back, his touch on her arm as impersonal as if he were hoisting a sack of grain. She accepted his help without a word, her body stiff and unyielding. They rode out of Bolton's as twilight deepened, leaving the stench of despair behind them. The silence that fell between them was as vast and profound as the desert itself. Eli rode ahead on his gelding, the rhythm of the hooves a lonely percussion in the immense quiet. Nietzsche followed on the mule, a small, dark shape against the fading light. The landscape was a panorama of stark, beautiful desolation. Towering mesas stood like silent sentinels, their faces glowing red in the last rays of the sun. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. A lone coyote howled, its voice a thin, mournful cry that seemed to echo the sorrow in their own hearts. They were strangers, bound by a piece of paper and a shared desperation. He, a man clinging to his past. She, a woman with no future. The vast, untamed wilderness around them was a mirror of the wild, unspoken territory that stretched between their two solitary souls. The journey home had begun. The Garrison homestead was less a ranch and more a stubborn prayer against the wilderness. It was tucked deep in a valley carved by an ancient, long-dead river, a place where the wind was a constant companion. It howled down from the mesas in the winter, a mournful, searching sound, and in the summer it was a hot, scouring breath that picked up sand and flung it against the small cabin until the wood was bleached pale as driftwood. The sun was relentless, baking the soil to a hard pan in which only the toughest grasses and most resilient wildflowers could survive. This land was Eli's inheritance, a legacy of grit and back-breaking labor. And it was a hard place to be alone. The cabin consisted of one main room, with a stone hearth at one end and a loft for storage overhead. His parents' sturdy bed occupied one corner, and on the opposite side, he had set up a simple cot for Naichi. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center, though for the first week, only one was ever used. The silence inside the cabin was as vast as the landscape outside. It was a heavy, watchful quiet, punctuated by the sigh of the wind or the distant lowing of his small herd of cattle. Into this silence, Naichi brought a rhythm of her own. She rose before the sun, a shadow moving in the pre-dawn gray. Eli would wake to the soft sounds of her stirring, the gentle scrape of the water pail, the quiet crackle of kindling in the hearth. She never made a sound that wasn't necessary. When he finally rose and came down from his own thoughts, the fire would be lit, and a pot of water would be warming over the flames. She expected nothing from him, no orders, no acknowledgement. She simply worked. Her days fell into a pattern of quiet, ceaseless labor. She fed the half-dozen chickens he kept, her movement so calm and steady that the birds, usually skittish, would peck corn from her outstretched palm. She milked their lone, sway-backed cow, her hands gentle and efficient. She took Eli's torn work shirts, the fabric worn thin as paper at the elbows and shoulders, and mended them with stitches so small and neat they were nearly invisible. She did not ask for the work. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it, claiming her place in this desolate valley not with words, but with the steady, undeniable presence of her hands. She was creating order in her small corner of the world, a bulwark against the chaos that had consumed her past. Eli watched her from a distance, a knot of confusion tightening in his gut. He had bought her, a fact that still sat uneasily upon his conscience. He had expected sullenness, perhaps resistance, or at the very least, a resentful compliance. He had not expected this silent, self-contained diligence. She was not working for him. She was working to exist, to anchor herself to the living world. He was a witness to her survival, and it made him feel like an intruder in his own home. He maintained his distance, a silent agreement passing between them. He was the man who owned the land, and she was the woman who lived upon it. They were 2 separate orbits, circling the same lonely star. Their dinners were the loneliest part of the day. Eli would sit at the table, his plate of beans and salted beef before him. Naichi would take her own small portion and sit on the floor by the hearth, her back to him, as if the fire were her only true companion. The space between the table and the hearth felt a mile wide. The silence was thick with everything they couldn't say, everything they didn't know about each other. He knew nothing of the life that had carved such stillness into her soul, and she knew nothing of the grief and fear that kept him staring into the darkness long after she had retired to her cot. The quiet wasn't hostile, not anymore. It had become a shared language of its own, a mutual acknowledgement of the gulf that lay between them. One evening, after nearly 2 weeks of this ritual, Eli found he could not bear the silence any longer. He looked at her small, straight back, the way she ate, with slow, deliberate movements, and a sudden, sharp loneliness pierced him. It was ridiculous. A man and a woman, a husband and a wife by law, living like ghosts in the same small room. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. "There's a second chair," he said, his voice rusty. Naichi froze, a piece of cornbread halfway to her lips. She didn't turn around, but he saw her shoulders tense. "It ain't gonna bite," he added, trying for a lighter tone and failing. "It's just a chair." For a long moment, she remained perfectly still. He thought she would ignore him, that the invisible wall between them was too solid to breach. He was about to turn back to his plate, the flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck, when she slowly, deliberately, rose to her feet. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then walked to the table and sat down in the other chair, placing her tin plate carefully on the wood. The space between them had shrunk from a mile to 2 feet. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. He could see the intricate pattern of the tiny scars that feathered across her cheekbone, the deep, dark brown of her eyes. For the first time, he forced himself to truly meet her gaze, and she, surprisingly, held it. He saw the familiar emptiness, the guarded wall he had first noticed at the trading post, but tonight, looking closer, he saw something more, a flicker of curiosity, a deep, quiet intelligence that was watching him, assessing him. Her gaze wasn't challenging, nor was it submissive. It was simply present. It was the first time he felt she was truly seeing him, not as a captor or a master, but as the man sitting across the table. The look lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer. In that shared gaze, a single, fragile thread was spun across the chasm between them. The rains came a week later, sweeping in from the north without warning. One moment the sky was a sheet of hazy blue. The next it was a bruised, churning cauldron of gray clouds. The wind, which had been a constant whisper, rose to a furious roar. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets that hammered against the roof and turned the dusty yard into a sea of churning mud. Eli was out with the cattle when it hit, and he spent the better part of an hour driving the small herd into the relative safety of a box canyon. Soaked to the bone and shivering, he finally made it back to the barn, only to hear a sound that made his blood run cold, the sharp, sickening crack of splintering timber. He threw open the barn doors to see that a huge section of the roof over the horse stalls had been torn away by the wind, leaving his 2 horses exposed to the violent deluge. Panic seized him. The horses were his lifeblood. Without them, he couldn't work the ranch, couldn't get to town, couldn't survive. Cursing the wind and the rain and his own bad luck, he scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft, grabbing a canvas tarp, a hammer, and a handful of nails. The wind on the roof was a physical force, trying to tear him from his perch. Rain blinded him as he struggled to pull the heavy, sodden tarp over the gaping hole. He was wrestling with a corner of the canvas, the wind whipping it from his numb fingers, when a small shape appeared at the top of the ladder. It was Naichi. Her hair was plastered to her face, her thin dress soaked through, but her expression was one of grim determination. She didn't say a word. She simply climbed onto the treacherous roof, her bare feet finding purchase on the slick wood, and took hold of the other end of the tarp. Together, they fought the storm. It was a battle of will against the elements, a desperate, unspoken partnership. He would shout an instruction, his words nearly snatched away by the gale, and she would understand. Pulling the canvas taut or holding a beam steady while he hammered furiously. The rain lashed at them, cold and relentless. The world was a symphony of chaos, the howl of the wind, the crash of thunder, the frantic pounding of the hammer. In the center of it all were the 2 of them, working as one, their shared purpose a silent bond against the storm's fury. Hours passed. The worst of the storm finally began to move on, the wind lessening its assault, the rain easing to a steady, drumming downpour. They had managed to secure the tarp, a temporary but vital fix. Eli hammered in the last nail and sagged against the roof, every muscle in his body screaming with exhaustion. He turned to say something to Naichi, a word of thanks, perhaps, but the words died in his throat. She was slumped against the roof peak, her head bowed, her arms wrapped around herself, and then, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, she simply crumpled, sliding down the wet shingles in a heap. He lunged, grabbing her arm before she could slide off the edge. She was completely spent, her body limp with an exhaustion so profound it had simply shut down. Adrenaline surged through him again. He maneuvered her carefully onto his shoulders, her slight weight a surprise, and carried her down the ladder. He stumbled through the mud and into the warm, dry haven of the cabin. The fire in the hearth was burning brightly. She must have stoked it before coming out to help him. He gently laid her down on the long wooden bench near the fire, her body shivering uncontrollably. He grabbed the thick wool blanket from his own bed and draped it over her. As he did, the collar of her wet dress fell open, exposing her shoulder and the top of her back to the flickering firelight. Eli froze. The skin of her shoulder was a roadmap of old pain. He had seen the fresh, angry red welts from the beating at the trading post. But these were different. These were old scars, pale and silver against her damp skin. A long, ropey line that ran from her collarbone down her back, crossed by a dozen smaller, thinner marks, like a tally of cruelties he couldn't begin to imagine. They were the marks of a life lived in torment, a testament to a history of violence that made the lashing at Bolton's post seem like a minor insult. He stared, his throat tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. A cold, quiet rage began to burn in his chest, a rage directed at the faceless, nameless men who had put those marks there. He looked at her face, peaceful now in utter exhaustion, and saw not just a survivor, but a warrior. He saw the strength it must have taken to endure that, to wake up every morning, to keep moving, to keep breathing. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder, wanting to offer a comfort he didn't know how to give. He pulled his hand back, gently. He tucked the blanket more securely around her, covering the scars from his sight, but not from his mind. He sat in the chair at the table all night, watching her sleep by the fire. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and quiet. But a different kind of storm had just begun inside of him. The piece of paper in his saddlebag, the marriage certificate, suddenly seemed like a foolish, flimsy thing. It was a contract for a wife, a legal necessity to keep his land. But the woman sleeping by his fire was not a contract. She was not a mail-order bride or Apache stock. She was a person, a woman who had worked beside him and fought a storm until she collapsed, a woman who carried a story etched into her very skin. And for the first time, Eli Garrison felt a desperate, aching need to learn how to read it. The morning after the storm, the world felt new. The air, scrubbed clean by the rain, was crisp and smelled of damp earth and creosote. Naichi was already awake when Eli came down from his loft, a pot of coffee just beginning to perfume the small cabin. She moved with a stiff, measured grace. The exhaustion from the night before settled deep in her bones, but she did not complain or slow her rhythm. He watched her for a moment, the memory of the scars on her shoulder a raw, vivid image in his mind. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements clumsy in the quiet. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "For the help with the roof." She paused in her task of kneading dough for the morning's bread, her back to him. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was more acknowledgement than he had expected. The new dynamic, born in the tempest, began to settle between them. The silence was still there, a vast territory between them, but its quality had changed. It was no longer a silence of awkwardness or avoidance, but one of quiet observation. He found himself watching the way her hands moved, whether she was grinding corn or plaiting a rope from stray bits of twine. There was an economy and purpose to her every action that spoke of a lifetime of learning, of skills he knew nothing about. A few days later, while checking a fence line near the creek, he saw her gathering the roots of a yucca plant. He dismounted and walked over, his curiosity overriding his caution. "My mother used to say you could make soap from that," he commented, more to himself than to her. Naichi looked up, her hands covered in dirt. "Soap," she confirmed, her voice low. "And food, and thread for weaving." She held up a fibrous strand she had stripped from the root. "The old ones taught us, nothing is without its purpose." The phrase, "the old ones," hung in the air between them. It was the first time she had mentioned a past, a people. Eli leaned against a cottonwood tree, feigning a casualness he did not feel. "The Apache?" he asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, her gaze returning to her work. "My father was Chato," she said, the name spoken with a quiet, unadorned reverence. "A chief of the Chiricahua. He taught me the names of the stars and the ways of the horse." She spoke in fragments, her voice a monotone, as if she were reciting a history learned from a book rather than one seared into her own flesh. She told him of a childhood of freedom in the Dragoon Mountains, a world of sun and rock and the close-knit warmth of her people. Then, the words grew sparser, the spaces between them heavier. She spoke of the bluecoats, the soldiers who came like a flood, their brass buttons glinting in the sun. She spoke of a dawn raid, of chaos, of smoke and the screams of people she loved. She didn't describe the violence. She described the silence that came after, the terrible, empty silence of a world that had been shattered. She was taken, a girl of 14, along with a few other women and children. That was where her story fractured into a series of grim vignettes. She was passed from a cavalry fort to a missionary settlement, where they tried to wash the Apache from her soul with harsh soap and harsher prayers. She was traded to a freight hauler for 2 blankets and a bag of flour, where she worked as a drudge, hauling water and cooking for men who looked through her as if she were made of glass. She spoke of a winter in a mining camp in the Rockies, where a fever had swept through the camp, and she had been left for dead in a lean-to, surviving only because an old Chinese cook had taken pity on her, forcing hot broth between her chapped lips. "Many hands have held my rope," she said, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon, a place only she could see. "Each one holds it for a time, then they let go, or they trade it to another." Eli listened without moving, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer empty words of sympathy. He understood that her story was not a plea for pity. It was a statement of fact, a map of her survival. To interrupt with his own feelings would be a violation. He simply stood there and received her words, offering her the silent respect of his attention. When she finally fell silent, the only sound was the rustle of the cottonwood leaves above them. He had asked a simple question about a plant, and had been given the shattered pieces of a life. From that day on, something shifted again. The next morning, as he saddled his bay, he also saddled the quieter of his 2 horses, a gentle mare. He led it to the cabin door where Naichi was sweeping the porch. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a question or a command, but a simple statement. She looked from him to the horse, a flicker of surprise in her dark eyes. Without a word, she put down the broom. She mounted the mare with a fluid grace that told him she had spoken the truth. She was born to the horse. They rode out together into the cool morning air. He didn't set a task, didn't head for a specific chore. He simply rode, leading her along the ridges that overlooked the valley, showing her the boundaries of the land. He pointed out the watering holes, the places where the grass grew thickest, the distant notch in the mountains that led toward town. He was showing her the shape of his world, and by extension, hers. They rode mostly in silence, but it was a new kind, a comfortable silence of shared space. He was no longer just the man who had bought her. He was the man who rode beside her. This became their new ritual. The morning rides were a time of peace, a quiet communion before the day's hard work began. They would watch jackrabbits dart through the sagebrush or track the high, circling flight of a hawk. He found himself talking more, telling her about his parents, about the dreams his father had for this land. She remained mostly quiet, but he learned to read her responses in the slight turn of her head or the way her eyes would soften when a fawn and its mother crossed their path. One afternoon, the work done, he found himself restless. "There's a place I want to show you," he said. He led her on foot, up the rocky incline behind the barn to a flat-topped outcrop of red rock that overlooked the entire valley. It had been his father's favorite spot. They sat on the sun-warmed stone, their legs dangling over the edge, and watched the world below. The homestead looked small and vulnerable from this height, a tiny island of human endeavor in a vast, indifferent wilderness. The sun began its slow descent, setting the western sky ablaze. The clouds were painted in strokes of gold and rose and fiery orange, the colors so intense they seemed to vibrate. The long shadows of the mesas stretched across the valley floor like dark fingers. It was a sight of such raw, heartbreaking beauty that it demanded silence. They sat shoulder to shoulder, close but not touching, as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into the soft purple of twilight. Naichi moved. It was a small, hesitant motion. She lifted her hand and lightly, tentatively, placed it on top of his where it rested on the rock between them. Her touch was feather-light, the skin of her palm cool and smooth against his calloused knuckles. A jolt, like a spark from flint and steel, shot up his arm. His first instinct was to pull away, a reaction born of years of solitude. But he fought it. He kept his hand perfectly still, accepting the contact, honoring the immense courage it must have taken for her to offer it. It was the first time she had touched him by choice. It wasn't a touch of necessity or accident, but a deliberate, fragile bridge built across the silence. He turned his head and looked at her. In the fading light, her profile was a stark, beautiful silhouette against the glowing sky. A new feeling began to stir within him, something deeper and more unsettling than gratitude or pity. Later that week, as they were walking back from the creek, a gust of wind swept down the valley. It caught her long, black hair, which she had unbound to wash, and sent it flying around her face like a silken banner. Eli stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The late afternoon sun caught the highlights in her hair, and her eyes, narrowed against the wind, seemed to hold all the mystery of the land itself. His gaze lingered on the high, proud curve of her cheekbone, dusted with sun, and the strong line of her jaw. He was struck by a sudden, powerful realization. She was beautiful. It wasn't the soft, manicured beauty of the women in the catalogs from back east. It was the beauty of a wind-scoured rock, of a soaring hawk, of something wild and resilient and utterly, breathtakingly alive. The thought was so unexpected, so potent, that it left him feeling dizzy and off balance. That night, sleep would not come. He lay on his bed, staring at the familiar patterns of moonlight on the ceiling, his mind replaying the moment her hand had covered his, the image of her hair flying in the wind. The cabin was filled with the soft, steady sound of her breathing from the cot across the room. A powerful, undeniable urge pulled him from his bed. He rose and crossed the floor, his bare feet silent on the cool wood planks. He stood over her cot, a looming shadow in the moonlight. She was on her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, her face relaxed in sleep. The harsh lines of endurance were smoothed away, leaving a look of profound peace that was almost childlike. He watched the gentle rise and fall of the blanket with each breath. He saw the way her eyelashes, thick and dark, rested against her skin. He was filled with a wave of tenderness so fierce it was almost an ache. This woman, who had endured so much, who had fought a storm and shared the ghosts of her past, was here, in his home, safe for now. He knelt beside the cot. He wanted to protect her, to stand as a shield between her and the cruelty of the world. It was a feeling so primal and overwhelming it shook him to his core. Slowly, carefully, he reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly. He brushed them over the back of her hand where it lay on the blanket. Her skin was warm. He let his fingers rest there, a light, chaste touch that conveyed everything he had no words for, his regret, his admiration, his burgeoning, terrifying affection. He stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the moonlight, simply holding her hand before rising as silently as he had come and returning to his bed. Across the room, Naichi lay perfectly still, her eyes closed, but she was not asleep. She had woken the moment his shadow fell over her body tensing with the old, familiar instinct of fear. But the fear had subsided when he did nothing but watch. She had felt the warmth of his fingers, the gentle, reverent pressure of his touch. It was a touch unlike any she had known since her father had held her hand as a child. A touch with no demand, no threat, no price. A touch that offered only kindness. She kept her breathing even, her body motionless. Feigning asleep she was far from, and as she lay there in the quiet darkness, a single, hot tear escaped the corner of her eye. It traced a silent path down her temple and into her hair. It was not a tear of sadness or of pain, but of a feeling so long forgotten she could not at first give it a name. It was the terrifying, heartbreaking agony of a frozen river beginning to thaw. The fragile peace that had settled over the Garrison homestead was shattered by the arrival of a man named Frank Carter. He rode a fine black stallion that was as well-fed and arrogant as its owner. Carter was a land speculator who had been buying up smaller homesteads in the territory. His methods a cocktail of legal pressure, veiled threats, and financial strangulation. He saw Eli's Valley not as a home, but as a prime piece of grazing land that was being wasted on a boy playing at being a rancher. He found Eli repairing the very section of barn roof that the storm had damaged. Carter dismounted, his polished boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, a stark contrast to Eli's own worn and mud-caked footwear. "Garrison," Carter began, his voice smooth and condescending. "Working hard. I see. A man can break his back on a place like this and still end up with nothing but blisters and dust. I've come to renew my offer." "The answer's the same as last time." "Carter," Eli said without turning around, his hammer blows falling a little harder. "This place ain't for sale." "Everything is for sale, son." Carter chuckled. "It's just a matter of the right price, or the right pressure. The land office is mighty particular about its homestead patents. They like to see families, thriving families." Just then, Naichi emerged from the cabin, a wooden bucket in her hands, heading for the well. She moved with her usual quiet grace, her eyes downcast. Carter's gaze fell upon her, and a slow, ugly smirk spread across his face. He watched her walk to the well, his eyes lingering on her form with an insulting familiarity. "Well, now," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer, "I see you went and got yourself a family after all. Didn't figure you for the type. Where'd you buy that one? Bolton's? Heard he's got a fresh batch of Indian property. Tell me, Garrison, how does it feel to bed down with a ragged squaw just to keep a patch of dirt?" Eli's hammer froze mid-swing. A cold, white-hot rage washed over him, so intense it made his vision swim. He turned slowly, his knuckles white around the handle of the hammer. "You get on your horse, Carter," he said, his voice dangerously low, "and you ride out of this valley before I forget myself." Carter laughed, a short, barking sound. "Getting touchy, are we? Don't worry. I won't tell the folks in town you're so desperate you had to take a chief's cast-off for a wife. Just remember my offer when you get tired of playing house." He swung himself back onto his horse, gave a mock salute, and cantered away, his laughter hanging in the air like poison. Eli stood shaking, the hammer feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. His gaze went to the well, but Naichi was gone. The bucket lay on its side by the well, and the cabin door was shut. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she had heard every word. The wall went back up. It was not a sudden, dramatic construction, but a quiet, meticulous rebuilding, brick by invisible brick. Naichi began to avoid him. She was never still, always finding a chore that kept her at the far end of the yard, in the barn, or inside the cabin when he was out. She no longer joined him for the morning rides, offering a silent shake of her head when he brought the saddled mare to the door. At meals, she retreated to her spot by the hearth, the chair opposite him at the table remaining starkly empty. The silence returned. But this time it was not a quiet space of observation. It was a cold, desolate wasteland of avoidance. Eli felt her withdrawal like a physical blow. The fragile connection they had built, the shared glances, the comfortable quiet, the light touch of her hand on the rock, it had all evaporated. He wanted to rage, to demand she look at him, to tell her that Carter's words were the ravings of a vile man. But he didn't know how. He was trapped in his own frustration, watching her pull away into a place he couldn't reach. His anger, having no other outlet, festered. A few days later, he rode into the small settlement of dusty streets and false front buildings that passed for a town. He needed flour and salt. But more than that, he needed to escape the suffocating quiet of the cabin, as fate would have it. Frank Carter was holding court on the porch of the saloon, a whiskey in his hand, his voice booming across the street, when he saw Eli tying up his horse at the general store. Carter's grin widened. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Carter called out, loud enough for the half-dozen loiterers to hear. "It's the Indian lover himself. Tell us, Garrison, does your little bride cook a good dog stew?" The men on the porch chuckled. Eli's vision narrowed to a single point, Carter's mocking face. The world went red at the edges. He abandoned his horse and crossed the street in 5 long strides. He didn't say a word. He simply swung, his fist connecting with Carter's jaw with a sickening crack. Carter staggered back, surprise and then fury twisting his features. The fight was a clumsy, brutal explosion of pent-up rage. They crashed off the porch and into the dusty street, trading wild, angry blows. It ended when the town marshal, a portly man named Davis with a drooping mustache, waded in and cracked Eli across the shoulders with his hickory stick. "That's enough," the marshal bellowed, hauling a bleeding and dust-covered Eli to his feet. "I won't have brawling in my town. Garrison, you know the rules." He was dragged to the marshal's office, where he was forced to listen to a lecture on public decency and fined $5 for disturbing the peace, a significant sum that he could ill afford. Carter, who had influential friends, was helped back to his feet and given a sympathetic pat on the back. As Eli paid his fine, his hands still shaking with adrenaline and fury, he could hear Carter's voice through the open window, boasting to the others about teaching the squaw man a lesson. The humiliation was a bitter acid in his throat. He rode home in a cold fury, the setting sun casting a bloody light over the land. The injustice of it all burned in him. He had defended her honor, his honor, and he was the one who was punished. When he reached the homestead, his anger was a living thing, a wild animal seeking a target. He saw Naichi by the barn, scattering feed for the chickens, her movements deliberately turned away from his approach. He dismounted, letting the reins drop, and stalked toward her. "What's the matter with you?" he demanded, his voice harsh. She flinched at his tone but didn't turn around. She continued to methodically toss grain to the birds. "Look at me," he commanded. Slowly, she turned. Her face was a pale, stoic mask, but her eyes were dark with a pain that mirrored his own anger. "Why have you been hiding from me?" he bit out, the words raw with frustration. "Do you think I care what a man like Carter says? Do his filthy words mean so much to you that you'd throw away everything we—" He trailed off, unsure what to even call what they had. "His words are the truth of your world," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They are what everyone thinks. They look at you and see a fool. They look at me and see—" She stopped, her throat working. "I don't give a damn what they see," he exploded, taking a step closer. His cut lip was throbbing. His shoulder ached from the marshal's stick, and his heart ached from her distance. "I care what you do. You just gave up. You heard one man's poison and you crawled back into your shell. You let him win." That was when her composure finally broke. The mask shattered, and her face crumpled. A tear, then another, traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. A raw, ragged sob escaped her, the first sound of true weeping he had ever heard from her. "I am not meant to bring you shame," she cried, the words torn from the deepest part of her. "My presence here, it stains you. I saw his face. I saw the town. This is my doing. I ain't meant to ruin your name." Her anguish struck him with the force of a physical blow, extinguishing his anger in an instant. It wasn't about her own pride. It wasn't about her being hurt by the insults. All this time, she had been trying to protect him. Her retreat wasn't an act of cowardice. It was an act of sacrifice. At that moment, the sky, which had been threatening all afternoon, finally broke. A cold rain began to fall, turning the dust around their feet to dark, slick mud. He looked at her, standing there, weeping silently in the downpour, and the last of his defenses crumbled. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. She was stiff at first, her body rigid with shock, but then she collapsed against him, her own sobs now muffled against the rough fabric of his shirt. He held her tight, his face buried in her wet hair, the rain plastering their clothes to their skin. The mud seeped into the hem of her dress and over the tops of his boots. The world was reduced to the sound of the rain, the desperate hammering of his own heart, and the warmth of her body pressed against his. He tilted her chin up, his thumb wiping away a tear. Her eyes, luminous with unshed grief, locked with his, in their depths. He saw everything, her past, her pain, her fear, and the quiet, fierce strength that had carried her through it all. And in that moment, under the weeping sky, surrounded by mud and the smell of rain, every barrier between them dissolved. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and hunger, of anger and forgiveness, of every unspoken word and every lonely night. It was a raw, bruising claiming, a desperate affirmation of life in a world that had tried to crush them both. She responded with a fierce, answering need, her hands clutching at his wet shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. He swept her up into his arms, her slight weight no burden at all, and carried her out of the rain and into the dark, silent cabin. He didn't light the lamp. The only light came from the dying, red gold embers in the hearth. He kicked the door shut, blocking out the sound of the storm. He set her down gently on the old bearskin rug before the fire, its worn fur a small island of warmth in the cold room. They knelt there, facing each other, water dripping from their hair and clothes, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold of the rain-soaked clothes was a stark contrast to the fire building between them. The longing that had been a quiet, tentative thing, a lingering glance, a light touch of hands, was now a roaring, undeniable force. There were no more words. Words were useless, clumsy things, with trembling hands. He unfastened the simple ties of her wet dress, and she helped him peel away his own soaked shirt. In the flickering, forgiving light of the fire, her scars were not marks of damage, but symbols of her endurance, a story he now understood. He touched them not with pity, but with a reverence that was almost a prayer. He pulled the old wool blanket from his bed and laid it over the rug. There, on that makeshift bed before the fire, 2 solitary souls, battered and bruised by the world, finally came together. It was a collision of loneliness and hope, a fierce and tender union born of storms both outside and in. Every touch was a question, every response an answer. Their bodies spoke a language of desperate, long-suppressed need, a language of finding shelter in one another, in the heart of that cold, lonely cabin, with the rain still drumming on the roof. They created a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The dawn that followed the storm was hushed and gentle, the light filtering into the cabin as if hesitant to disturb the newfound peace. The air was no longer heavy with unspoken things, but filled with a quiet intimacy that was as tangible as the scent of damp earth outside. When Eli woke, it was to find Naichi already awake, her dark eyes watching him from the other side of the pillow. They were no longer in separate beds. on opposite sides of the room, sometime during the night of rain and whispers and shared warmth. The cot on the far side of the room had been rendered obsolete. He reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his touch gentle and questioning. She did not flinch or pull away. Instead, she leaned into his hand for a brief, startling moment, a silent affirmation that the world had irrevocably changed. The walls between them, breached by the storm of emotion, had not been rebuilt. In their place was a fragile, luminous landscape of new feeling, a territory they would now have to navigate together. Their life fell into a different rhythm. The silence between them remained, for neither of them were people of many words, but it was now a comfortable, breathing thing. It was the silence of two people working in tandem, of shared glances across the yard that said more than a dozen sentences. She began to smile, small, fleeting things that would light up her eyes and make Eli's heart ache with a feeling so sharp and sweet he didn't have a name for it. A week later, they rode to town together for supplies. It was the first time they had gone as a true couple. As Eli dismounted in front of the general store, he turned and offered Naichi his hand. She took it without hesitation, and they walked onto the porch together, their linked hands a quiet declaration. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, stopped his sweeping, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly as they entered. "Morning, Eli," he said, his gaze flicking from their joined hands to Naichi's face and back again. "Henderson," Eli nodded, his voice calm and steady. He picked up a sack of flour and set it on the counter. "Need this and a bag of coffee beans. My wife needs some sewing needles, if you have any." The words, "my wife," fell from his lips with a natural, unforced ease. It was the first time he had said them in public, not as a legal justification, but as a simple statement of fact. The air in the store grew thick and still. "Mr." Henderson stared for a moment before clearing his throat and turning to get the needles, his movements stiff. The few other customers in the store fell silent, their conversations dying in their throats. Whispers followed them like shadows as they left the store and made their way down the street. Naichi kept her head held high, her expression unreadable, but Eli could feel a slight tension in her hand. He squeezed it gently, a silent message of solidarity. He was done hiding. She was his wife, and he would not let this town make him ashamed of it. But the town was not so easily persuaded. The whispers grew into a low, steady murmur of disapproval. Eli was a fool, a disgrace to his parents' memory, and the Apache woman was a heathen, a savage who had no place among decent, God-fearing folk. The animosity was a constant, low-grade fever, but it broke into a full-blown sickness one sweltering afternoon at the public well. Naichi had gone to fetch water, as the spring on their own land was running low in the summer heat. As she approached the stone well in the center of the town square, she saw a group of women gathered there, their Bibles in their hands, fresh from a meeting of the church sewing circle. They were led by Mrs. Beatrice Gable, a tall, severe-looking woman who saw the world in rigid shades of black and white, and Naichi was decidedly in the former category. As Naichi reached for the rope, Mrs. Gable stepped forward, physically blocking her path. The other women formed a small, formidable wall behind her. "This well is for the townsfolk," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with sanctimonious chill. Naiche looked at her, her face calm. "I am thirsty." "There is a trough for livestock behind the saloon." One of the other women sneered, "Your kind should be used to that." "We will not have you dirtying our water," Mrs. Gable declared, her voice rising. "We are Christian women. We cannot abide a heathen presence in our midst. Go back to the wild where you belong." Naichi stood there for a long moment, the empty bucket heavy in her hand. She looked at each of their faces, hard, unforgiving, and full of a certainty that passed for righteousness. There was no hatred in her own eyes, only a deep, weary sorrow. She did not argue. She did not plead. To do so would be to grant them a power over her that she would not give, with a quiet dignity that was more profound than any angry retort. She simply turned around and began the long, hot walk back to the homestead, her bucket still empty. The incident hardened the lines in the town. Many saw the women's actions as just and proper, but the cruelty of it left a sour taste in the mouths of a few. One of them was Sarah Finch, a young woman whose husband worked a small claim at the edge of Carter's property. Sarah was a quiet, gentle soul, and she had seen the confrontation at the well with a troubled heart. A week later, Sarah's world fell apart. Her 5-year-old son, Daniel, was struck by a fever. It came on suddenly, a raging fire that left him delirious and weak. The town's doctor, a man whose knowledge came more from a bottle than a book, administered useless powders and declared it was in God's hands. For 2 days, Sarah sat by her son's bedside, bathing his forehead with cool water, watching in terror as the fever climbed, refusing to break. She was frantic, her prayers growing more desperate as her son's breathing grew more shallow. On the 3rd night, at her wit's end, she remembered something. She had overheard 2 old prospectors talking once about how the Apache knew the secrets of the earth, how they could make medicine from roots and leaves that could cool the hottest fever. It was a heathen notion, a dangerous one. But watching her son tremble and moan in his sleep, she found she no longer cared about propriety. Leaving her husband to watch over the boy, Sarah ran from her small cabin. She ran through the darkness, stumbling over rocks and roots, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She ran all the way to the garrison homestead, a place she had been taught to fear and despise. She pounded on the cabin door, her knuckles raw, her sobs choking her. Eli threw the door open, a rifle in his hand, to find the distraught woman on his doorstep. "Please," Sarah Finch gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Please, I need your wife. They say she has the old knowledge. My boy, my Daniel, he's dying of the fever." Eli looked at Nietzsche, who had risen from the bed and stood behind him, wrapped in a blanket. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the memory of the women at the well still a fresh wound. To help this woman would be to help the very people who scorned her. But then he saw Sarah's raw, maternal agony, and he saw the conflict in Nietzsche's face resolve into something else, compassion. Without a word, Nietzsche went to a small leather pouch where she kept her precious store of dried herbs and roots. She slipped on her moccasins, pulled on a dress, and followed Sarah out into the night, Eli walking beside her, a lantern held high. At the Finch cabin, the air was thick with the smell of sickness and fear. Nietzsche went immediately to the boy's side. She touched his forehead, his neck, her hands gentle and sure. She listened to his ragged breathing. Then she set to work. She sent Eli and a grateful Mr. Finch to the creek bed to gather willow bark and into the hills to find yarrow flowers. She ground the bark into a fine powder and brewed a bitter tea, which she patiently coaxed, spoonful by spoonful, between the boy's cracked lips. She crushed leaves into a fragrant poultice and applied it to his chest and forehead. She worked all night, a figure of serene competence in a room full of panic. She did not speak of prayers or of God. She spoke to the fever itself, her low, quiet chanting a soothing melody that seemed to calm the very air. Sarah Finch watched, her initial fear of the Apache medicine replaced by a growing sense of awe and hope. This woman did not work with dark magic. She worked with the earth, with a knowledge that was as old and as deep as the mountains themselves. Toward dawn, something shifted. The boy's violent shivering eased. A light sweat broke out on his forehead. His breathing, while still shallow, became more regular. By the time the sun's first rays touched the valley, Daniel's eyes fluttered open. The fever had broken. Word of the miracle at the Finch cabin spread through the town like wildfire. Daniel's recovery was swift and complete. Sarah Finch, in her gratitude, became Nietzsche's most vocal defender, telling anyone who would listen how the Apache woman had saved her son's life when all hope was lost. For some, It was enough. People began to look at Nietzsche differently. A few would offer a hesitant nod when she and Eli rode into town. One farmer, whose own child had survived a winter sickness years before, left a small basket of fresh eggs on their porch. But for others, like Mrs. Gable and her circle, the healing was proof of something sinister. It was witchcraft. They whispered, a devil's bargain. The fear and hatred did not disappear. It simply burrowed deeper, becoming more bitter and resentful. Nietzsche had become a symbol, a savior to some, a threat to others. The division was never more apparent than on the day of the autumn market fair. The whole territory seemed to have gathered in the town square, a bustling, noisy celebration of the harvest. Eli was negotiating the price of a new bull, leaving Nietzsche to wander through the stalls. She moved through the crowd, a solitary island in a sea of activity. People parted before her. Conversations would stop as she passed, only to resume in hushed tones behind her back. Mothers would pull their children a little closer. No one met her eye. The isolation was a physical presence, a cold bubble that surrounded her even in the warmth of the autumn sun. Eli finished his business and saw her. She was standing near the baker's stall, looking at a display of pies, but not truly seeing them. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, in the middle of 100 people. A familiar, hot anger surged in his chest, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of fierce, protective love. He started walking toward her. He didn't hurry. His steps were slow, deliberate, and purposeful. Every eye in that square was on him as he crossed the open space. He ignored the stares, the whispers, the sudden, watchful silence that fell over the crowd. He saw only her. He stopped in front of her, and she looked up, her eyes full of a quiet, resigned pain that broke his heart. He gave her a small, soft smile. And then, in the full view of the entire town, he reached out and took her hand. He laced his fingers through hers, a firm, unwavering grip. He did not say a word. He didn't need to. The simple, public act of taking her hand was a louder declaration than any shout. It said, "She is with me. She is my wife. Her place is at my side. If you have a problem with her, you have a problem with me." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Jaws dropped. Mrs. Gable, who was watching from the church steps, looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Eli held Nietzsche's hand, turned, and began to lead her through the stunned, silent crowd, which parted before them like the Red Sea. They walked away from the market, their joined hands a bridge between them, and a gauntlet thrown down to the world. The fragile truce Eli had forged with the town was shattered by the arrival of the United States cavalry. They rode in not with the thunder of a charge, but with the mundane clatter and dust of a routine patrol. A column of blue-clad men whose presence brought a chilling air of federal authority to the small, isolated settlement. They were led by a young lieutenant named Hayes, a man with a sharp jaw and eyes that saw the world in terms of regulations and duty. He was not an evil man, merely an instrument of a system that had little room for nuance or mercy. Eli and Nietzsche were in the general store, stocking up on winter provisions. When the patrol halted in the square, a murmur went through the town as people came out of their shops and homes to watch. For most, the cavalry was a symbol of protection. For Nietzsche, the sight of the blue uniforms and yellow stripes was a visceral reminder of a past she could never truly escape. A tremor went through her hand, and Eli instinctively tightened his grip. Lieutenant Hayes dismounted, his movements crisp and efficient, and began speaking with Marshal Davis. His gaze swept the square, a bored, professional assessment, until it landed on Nietzsche as she and Eli stepped out onto the porch of the store. Hayes's expression changed. The boredom vanished, replaced by a flicker of sharp, clinical recognition. He had spent a year as a junior officer at the San Carlos Reservation, a place of heat, dust, and despair. He had a keen memory for faces, especially those of the runaways who were a constant source of frustration for the authorities. He broke off his conversation with the marshal and strode purposefully across the square, his boots crunching in the dirt. He stopped a few feet from them, his eyes fixed solely on Naichi. "I know you," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You're the daughter of Chado. You escaped from the reservation 2 years ago. You are considered fugitive property of the United States government." The world seemed to stop. The casual chatter of the townspeople died, leaving a thick, ringing silence. Every eye in the square was now fixed on the three of them. Naichi went rigid, all the color draining from her face. She looked like a cornered animal, poised for a flight that she knew was impossible. "You're mistaken, Lieutenant," Eli said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stepped forward slightly, placing himself squarely between Hayes and Naichi. It was a simple movement, but it was an unmistakable act of defiance. Hayes's gaze shifted to Eli, his eyes narrowing. "Step aside. Civilian, this is a federal matter. The woman is coming with us." He gestured to 2 of his troopers, who dismounted and started toward them. "No," Eli said, the word a solid wall. "She is not. She's my wife." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Frank Carter, who had been watching from the saloon porch, let out a smug, satisfied laugh. "Mrs." Gable clutched the Bible she always carried, a look of vindicated triumph on her face. "Your wife?" Hayes scoffed, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. "That's a territorial matter. My orders concern federal property. Now, stand down before I have you arrested for interfering with a military operation." The 2 soldiers moved to flank Eli, their hands resting on their pistols. The town watched, holding its collective breath. This was the moment of truth. Eli could step aside, could save himself from the wrath of the U.S. Army, could let them take the Indian property and return to his solitary life. He looked over his shoulder at Naichi. Her eyes were wide with terror, not for herself, but for him. And in that moment, he knew there was no choice to be made. "You'll have to go through me," Eli said, his feet planted firmly in the dust. "She's not going anywhere." The standoff was broken by Marshal Davis, who bustled forward, his face slick with sweat. "Now, hold on, Lieutenant," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "We can't have this brawling in the square. This is a legal matter. This man claims she's his legal wife. We'll have to lock them both up until the circuit judge can sort it out." It was a weak compromise, but it was enough to prevent immediate bloodshed. Hayes, loath to cause a public incident that would require reams of paperwork, reluctantly agreed. Eli and Naichi were escorted to the town's small, squalid jail, a 2-cell stone building behind the marshal's office. The heavy iron door clanged shut behind them, the sound an echo of finality. The townspeople began to disperse, buzzing with the scandal, having witnessed the final, public ruin of Eli Garrison. The cell was cold and smelled of damp earth and stale despair. A sliver of afternoon light fell through a single, high-barred window. They were alone. As soon as the marshal's footsteps faded, Naichi's composure, held together by sheer will, finally crumbled. She sank onto the dirty floor, her body shaking with violent, silent sobs. Eli knelt beside her, his heart breaking. He reached out to touch her, but she recoiled, pulling away from him. "You should not have done this," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "You should have let them take me." "Don't say that," he said, his own voice hoarse. "I wasn't ever going to let that happen." "You don't understand," she cried, looking up at him, her face a mask of anguish. "This is the end for you. They will take everything, the ranch, your name, your freedom. All because of me. You must tell them it was a mistake. Tell them I am nothing to you, please. Eli, let me go. Let me be the one to pay." Her words were a desperate plea, a frantic attempt to sever herself from him to save him from the consequences of her own existence. She saw herself as a blight, a disease that would destroy everything he had worked for. He took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. His blue eyes were fierce, unwavering. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "You are not nothing. Do you hear me? You are not a rope to be traded. You are not a debt to be paid." He paused, his throat tight with an emotion so powerful it almost stole his breath. "You're my precious one, mine, and I will not lose you." She stared at him, her sobs quieting, her eyes searching his. In his gaze, she did not see a man who pitied her or a man who owned her. She saw a man who cherished her, who saw her worth even when she could not see it herself. She leaned into his touch and wept, no longer from fear, but from a love so profound it was almost as painful as her grief. The hearing was held 2 days later. It wasn't a formal trial, just a proceeding before Justice Miller, an elderly, pragmatic man who was more concerned with keeping peace in his territory than with federal statutes. The room was packed. Lieutenant Hayes presented his case with military precision. Nietzsche was a ward of the government who had fled federal custody. He had a duty to return her. Eli stood, his face bruised but his resolve firm. "She is my lawfully wedded wife," he stated. "We were married by a justice of the peace. We have a certificate." "A flimsy piece of paper," Hayes countered. "A sham marriage to harbor a fugitive." It was at this point that a new voice spoke from the back of the room. "The marriage is legal and binding in the eyes of God and the law." All heads turned. Reverend Michael, the town's stoic and widely respected minister, stepped forward. He was a man who had, until now, remained silent on the matter of Eli's marriage, neither condemning nor condoning it. "I have seen the certificate," the Reverend announced, his voice filling the small room. "While the circumstances of their union were unorthodox, they are legally man and wife under the laws of this territory. The woman is not a stray animal. Lieutenant, she is Mrs. Nietzsche Garrison, a citizen of this community. A wife is not the property of the government. She is under the protection of her husband." Justice Miller listened, stroking his beard. He was caught between the U.S. Army and the laws of his own territory. The Reverend's testimony had given him the legal foothold he needed. "Lieutenant Hayes," he declared, "while I respect your duties, I cannot authorize the seizure of a legally married woman from her husband without a federal warrant from a higher court. As it stands, she has committed no crime in this jurisdiction. They are free to go." A stunned silence filled the room, broken by an angry curse from Lieutenant Hayes and a triumphant cry from Sarah Finch. Eli and Nietzsche were released, walking out of the courthouse and into the sunlight, legally free. They had won. But it was a victory that cost them everything. The next morning, Eli went to the bank to arrange his usual line of credit for spring seed and to make a payment on the loan his father had taken out years ago. Mr. Albright, the banker, a man with eyes like cold gray stones, did not invite him to sit down. "Eli," he said, his tone flat, "I'm afraid the board has reviewed your account. Given your recent public difficulties and the instability of your domestic situation, we no longer consider you a sound investment. Your credit has been revoked. Furthermore, the full balance of your father's loan is due at the end of the month." The words hit Eli like a punch to the gut. "The end of the month? That's impossible. I don't have that kind of cash. I need the credit to buy seed, to have a crop to sell." "I'm sorry, son," Albright said, though his face showed no sorrow at all. "Business is business. Frank Carter has already expressed an interest in taking over the loan should you default." Eli walked out of the bank, the world tilting on its axis. He saw it all with sickening clarity. They had won in the courthouse, but they had lost the war. They had been exonerated by the law, but condemned by the town. Without the loan, without credit, he couldn't plant a crop. He couldn't make the payment. He would lose the ranch. He would lose his home, his parents' legacy, the one thing he had fought so hard to protect. He spent the rest of the day in a haze of despair, trying to find a way out where there was none. That night, he and Nietzsche lay in bed, the silence between them heavy with the unspoken truth of their ruin. He held her close, a desperate, protective gesture, and eventually fell into a troubled, exhausted sleep. When he woke in the gray light of dawn, the space beside him was cold. He sat up, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. "Naichi?" There was no answer. He saw that her moccasins were gone. The small leather pouch of herbs was gone. He looked around the quiet, empty cabin, his heart pounding. Then he saw it. On the small wooden table, weighted down by a stone, was a piece of torn paper. His hands trembled as he picked it up. On it, in the simple, careful letters she had been learning to write, were 5 words. "Let me be the one to suffer." The 5 words on the piece of paper were a blade that slid between Eli's ribs. "Let me be the one to suffer." He read them again and again in the cold, gray light of the cabin, the silence roaring in his ears. It was a confession of love wrapped in the language of sacrifice, a final, desperate act to save him by destroying herself. A wave of cold fury washed over him, chasing away the initial shock. Fury at her, for thinking she could make such a choice for him. Fury at himself, for falling asleep, for not seeing the depth of her despair, and a black, bottomless rage at the world that had convinced her she was worth nothing more than her own suffering. He didn't waste time on grief. Grief was a luxury for later. This was a hunt. He moved with a feverish, mechanical purpose. He shoved hardtack and jerky into his saddlebags, filled his canteen, and grabbed his rifle. He didn't know where she was going, but he knew what she was running from. Her own perceived power to ruin him. She wouldn't go to another town. Towns were cages. She would go to the wild, the only place she had ever known a semblance of freedom. The first day was a frantic, desperate search of the familiar. He rode the ridges where they had watched the sun rise, his eyes scanning the vast, empty landscape for any sign of a lone figure on foot. He followed the creek bed, calling her name until his voice was raw, the sound swallowed by the wind. He found nothing but the tracks of deer and coyote, the land they had shared, which had begun to feel like a sanctuary, now felt like a vast, mocking tomb. For 3 days, he rode in a widening circle, his hope growing as brittle as a dry leaf. He stopped at isolated way stations and remote trading posts, describing her to wary, suspicious men who either shook their heads or offered a lewd comment about runaway squaws that made him want to pull them from their chairs. He pushed his horse, the sturdy bay, to the limits of its endurance, and then pushed further. He barely ate, and sleep was a series of brief, nightmarish dozes from which he would wake with a jolt, her name on his lips. He searched caves where they might have sheltered, stands of cottonwood by hidden springs. The world became a blur of rock and dust and sky, and his search became a primal, singular focus. Find her. Meanwhile, Naichi was on a journey of her own, not of escape, but of return. With the instincts of an animal returning to its den, she walked east toward the jagged, saw-toothed peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. This was the land of her people, the heart of the Chiricahua. She knew the cavalry had scattered them, that most were dead or imprisoned on reservations. But she also knew the Apache spirit was not so easily extinguished. There would be survivors, the ghosts, as the white men called them, families hiding in the high, inaccessible canyons, living as their ancestors had, clinging to the old ways like the last stubborn leaves on a winter tree. She walked with a purpose that belied the ache in her heart. She was not just Naichi, the runaway, the contract wife. She was the daughter of Chateau. Her name still carried weight among the people. If she could find them, she would not beg. She would ask for their help, not for herself, but for the white man who had shown her kindness, who had called her precious. Perhaps they had knowledge of hidden silver, of wild herbs that could be sold for coin, some way to fight back against the world that was crushing him. It was a desperate, foolish hope, but it was the only one she had left. On the 5th day of his search, Eli was running on little more than raw will. He had ridden so far east that the landscape had begun to change, the flat plains giving way to rolling foothills and rocky canyons. He had lost her trail, if there ever was one. He was following a ghost, a memory. Despair was beginning to set in, a cold, heavy dread that he had lost her forever. He was about to turn back, defeated, when he saw it, a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from a deep, secluded arroyo miles ahead. It was a fool's errand. It could be prospectors, outlaws, anything. But it was something, a flicker of hope in the vast emptiness. He guided his exhausted horse off the main trail, moving slowly and cautiously through the scrub oak and manzanita. As he drew closer, he dismounted, tethering his horse and continuing on foot, his rifle held ready. He crept to the edge of the arroyo and peered down. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It was a small, hidden encampment, barely more than a few brush shelters, or wickiups, tucked under an overhang of rock. A handful of people moved with a quiet, ghost-like purpose. A young boy tending a few goats, 2 women weaving baskets, and an old woman, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, sitting by a small, smokeless fire. Kneeling before the old woman was Naichi. She was not the woman who had left his cabin. Her hair was bound in the traditional Apache way. She wore a simple deerskin dress he had never seen before. She looked thinner, her face etched with weariness. But there was a stillness about her, a sense of belonging that he had never seen before. She was scraping the bark from a pile of roots with a sharp stone, her hands moving with an ancient, practiced skill. She spoke to the old woman in the low, guttural tones of the Apache language, her voice softer, more natural than he had ever heard it. Eli stood there, hidden by a juniper bush, and simply watched. He saw her not as his wife, not as the woman who had left him, but as a person complete in and of herself, a part of a world he could never truly know. He saw her strength, her heritage, her grace. The sight filled him with an awe so profound it drove the anger and the fear from his heart. He was not looking at a fugitive. He was looking at a queen in her lost kingdom. He finally stepped out from behind the bush. The young boy saw him first and let out a startled cry. Scrambling behind one of the shelters, the women froze, their eyes wide and hostile. Naichi looked up, her hand stopping mid-scrape. When she saw him, her face went through a rapid, devastating series of emotions. Shock, then fear, then a deep, soul-crushing guilt. The stone fell from her hand, clattering on the rocks. Eli didn't say a word. He started walking down the steep, rocky path into the arroyo. The old woman watched him, her eyes as dark and sharp as obsidian, but she did not move. Naichi scrambled to her feet. She looked as if she wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. He stopped a few feet from her. He was covered in dust, his face unshaven, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. He looked as wild and broken as she felt. "Eli," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing. He still said nothing. He just looked at her, his gaze drinking her in, assuring himself that she was real, that she was safe. The silence was broken by Naichi. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, and then she fell to her knees in the dirt before him. She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. "I am sorry," she wept, the words torn from her. "I have brought you only ruin. I tried to leave so you would be free. I am sorry." Her apology, her utter self-abasement, was the final undoing of him. He reached down and gripped her arms, pulling her roughly to her feet. He was not gentle. His hands were shaking. "Ruin," he said, his voice a raw, ragged whisper. "Ruin is an empty cabin. Ruin is waking up and you're not there. The land, the money, the bank, that's all just dirt and paper. It means nothing. You are not the one who suffers. I am without you." He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in a crushing, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her hair. inhaling her scent of wood smoke and earth, and held on as if he were a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. He was shaking, and he realized with a start that he was crying. Hot, silent tears of sheer, overwhelming relief. She was stiff in his arms for only a moment before she melted against him, her own arms wrapping tightly around his waist, her face pressed into his chest. They stood like that for a long time, two broken halves made whole again, clinging to each other in the heart of that hidden canyon while the silent ghosts of her people looked on. They rode back to the homestead side by side. The old woman had given them a small pouch of corn and dried meat for their journey, a silent blessing from a world he had only glimpsed. The journey home was not like their first ride from the trading post. The silence now was one of profound, unspoken understanding. They had faced ruin, and they had chosen each other. They returned to a place that felt both familiar and irrevocably changed. The threat of foreclosure still hung over them like a storm cloud, but the despair was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared resolve. They would face it together. The idea came a few weeks later. Daniel Finch, now a healthy, boisterous boy, had come down with a bad cough. Sarah, without a second's hesitation, had brought him straight to Nietzsche, who had brewed him a soothing tea of mullein leaf that eased his breathing within the hour. As Sarah was leaving, her face alight with gratitude, she said, "I wish I knew what you know. I wish I could care for my family the way you do." The words sparked something in Eli's mind. He looked at Nietzsche, and then at the old, disused section of the barn, the part that hadn't been destroyed in the storm. It was sturdy, with good light. "We don't have a crop to sell," he said to her that evening, his voice full of a new, cautious excitement. "We don't have money, but we have this. You have this, your knowledge." And so, a new beginning took root in the unlikeliest of places. They cleaned out the old section of the barn, sweeping away the hay dust and mending the walls. Eli built a long, rough-hewn table and a few simple benches. It wasn't a schoolhouse in any formal sense. It was simply a place to share what was known. Nietzsche began to teach. At first, only Sarah Finch and her son came. Nietzsche, shy and hesitant at first, showed them which plants soothed a fever, which leaves could be made into a poultice for a cut, which roots eased a troubled stomach. Her classroom was the hills and the creek bed. The barn was where they learned to prepare the medicines. Word spread slowly. A few other women from the town, their own children having suffered through illnesses, began to come, their curiosity overcoming their prejudice. And then, a small family of displaced Yavapai, hearing whispers of the Apache woman who healed, came from the hills, their children's eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Nietzsche's school became a quiet, revolutionary place, in the dusty, sunlit space of that old barn. The children of the settlers and the children of the native tribes sat side by side on the same rough benches. They learned the common language of the earth, a knowledge that predated the conflict and the hatred of their parents. They learned not from a book, but from the land itself, and from the quiet, dignified woman who had decided that the only way to heal a broken world was to start with its smallest, most vulnerable pieces. Years did not heal all wounds, but they could, with time and care, turn scarred land into a garden. The Garrison homestead, once a lonely testament to one man's stubbornness, blossomed. The wind still scoured the valley, and the sun was still a hammer in the summer. But the ranch was no longer a place of mere survival. It was a place of life. The first winter after Nietzsche's return had been the hardest. They had survived on what little they could hunt and forage, and on the small but steady stream of goods brought by grateful families. A sack of potatoes from the Finches, a side of bacon from a farmer whose wife Nietzsche had cured of a lung sickness. The payments were never in cash, but in the currency of the frontier: food, tools, and respect. Eli worked the land with a grim determination, while Nietzsche's knowledge of the earth became their true harvest. She sold carefully prepared bundles of medicinal herbs to the very general store where the town had once scorned her. Mr. Henderson, seeing the steady demand, began to stalk them, his gruff respect for her skill overriding his previous prejudice. They had saved the ranch not with a miracle, but with 1,000 small, tenacious acts. When the payment for the loan came due, Eli rode to the bank not with a bag full of cash, but with a ledger. It was a record of every family Nietzsche had helped, every barter they had made, and a signed petition from nearly 1/3 of the valley's homesteaders attesting to the garrison's vital role in the community. Frank Carter was there, ready to collect his prize, but he had underestimated the slow, powerful shift in public opinion, faced with a potential revolt from his own customers, and the quiet but firm support of Reverend Michael. Mr. Albright the banker had reluctantly, grudgingly, agreed to a new payment plan. It was a small victory, but it was enough. Now, 4 years later, the ranch was a different world. The barn school was the heart of it. The long table Eli had built was now scarred with the nicks and drawings of children. But it was the other inhabitants of the homestead that marked the truest change. They were known in the valley as the Lost Ones, children of mixed blood, born of violent encounters or fleeting unions between soldiers and native women, belonging to neither world and abandoned by both. The first had been a boy named Sam, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's Apache cheekbones. Left on their doorstep in the middle of the night, Nietzsche had simply brought him inside, bathed him, and given him a bowl of warm stew, and he had been theirs ever since. 2 others had followed, a shy girl named Lily, whose Mexican mother had died and whose white father had a new family that wanted no part of her, and a toddler they called Sparrow, found wandering alone near a burned-out wagon. They were not adopted in any legal sense. They were simply gathered. They were the children of the valley, and the garrison homestead was their sanctuary. The sound of their laughter was a constant, joyful music that had long ago banished the ghosts of loneliness from the small cabin. The town had changed, too, or perhaps it had simply been forced to confront a truth it had long ignored. Nietzsche was no longer the squaw. She was the healer, or simply Mrs. Garrison. Men who had once sneered now tipped their hats. The women of the sewing circle, led by a humbled and quiet Mrs. Gable, now sent bundles of scrap fabric to the ranch for the children's clothes. The change was not universal. There would always be the hard, hateful stares from a few, but the tide had turned. They had not been assimilated by the town. The town had, in its own small way, been forced to grow around them. It was on a warm evening in late spring, with the scent of blooming primrose heavy in the air, that Eli turned to Nietzsche as they sat on the porch, watching the children play. "I was thinking," he said, his voice quiet. "That first wedding, it was a sorry affair. It was for the law. It wasn't for us." Nietzsche looked at him, her dark eyes calm and knowing. "We did not need a piece of paper, Eli." "No," he agreed, taking her hand. "We don't, but I want to stand up with you, in front of everyone, not because we have to, but because I choose to, because I want the whole world to see the honor of being your husband." And so they planned a second wedding. There was no fancy dress, no engraved invitations. The news spread by word of mouth, carried on the wind across the valley. The ceremony was to be held in the meadow behind the homestead, a place that, in the late spring, was a riot of color, a carpet of Indian paintbrush, blue bonnets, and yellow poppies. On the day of the wedding, the town came. They came on horseback and in wagons, their faces not filled with scorn or morbid curiosity, but with a quiet, genuine respect. Sarah and Daniel Finch were there. Daniel, now a strong, healthy boy who ran to hug Nietzsche the moment he saw her. Reverend Michael arrived, his Bible in his hand and a rare, warm smile on his face. Marshall Davis, long since retired, came with a whittled wooden horse for Sparrow. Even Mr. Henderson from the general store was there, awkwardly holding a small sack of horehound candy. It was a congregation of people once bound by prejudice, now brought together by the quiet, undeniable goodness of the two people standing before them. Nietzsche wore a simple dress of soft, pale buckskin, embroidered at the collar and cuffs with intricate patterns of wildflowers that she and Lily had sewn together. Her hair was unbound, a shining black river falling down her back. She was not the broken, silent girl from the trading post, nor the haunted woman who had fought a storm. She was a woman in full possession of her own grace, her face serene, her eyes filled with a deep and radiant light. Eli stood waiting for her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was not the desperate, lonely boy trying to save a patch of dirt. He was a man who had found a home not in the land, but in the heart of the woman walking toward him. There were no pews, only the soft grass. The only music was the sigh of the wind and the distant song of a meadowlark. Reverend Michael read a simple passage from the Bible, but the real vows were the ones they spoke to each other, their voices low, meant only for one another, yet heard by all. "You found me in the dust," Nietzsche said, her voice clear and steady. "You saw me when I was invisible. You gave my spirit a place to rest. My heart is your home, Eli, as this valley is mine." Eli took her hands, his own calloused ones trembling slightly. "You taught me what strength is," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught me what home is. It's not the land. It's not the cabin. It's you. It has always been you." They sealed their vows not with a formal pronouncement, but with a kiss that was as gentle and as profound as the land around them. A cheer went up from the assembled crowd, a genuine, heartfelt sound of celebration that echoed across the valley. Later, as the sun began to dip below the mesas, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and gold, the celebration wound down. The children, exhausted from playing, were asleep inside the cabin. The guests had begun their slow journeys home, leaving behind a feeling of quiet, settled joy. Eli and Nietzsche stood alone at the edge of the meadow, his arms wrapped around her from behind, her head resting against his chest. They watched the last of the light fade, the air growing cool. A soft, genuine laugh escaped Nietzsche's lips, a sound of pure, unburdened happiness. It was a sound Eli had once thought he would never hear, and it was more precious to him than gold. He leaned down, his lips close to her ear. "What is it?" he murmured. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice soft, "of a girl who once said she was not worth much." Eli held her tighter, a fierce, protective love washing over him. He pressed his lips to her temple, the words, a sacred, final truth whispered into her soul. "You're worth more than all this land," he whispered. "You're my heart." The last light of the day bled across the horizon, a deep, majestic crimson. The vast, silent land of the American West stretched out before them, a place of harsh beauty and unforgiving truths. But in one small valley, two souls who had been shattered by the cruelty of that world had found each other in the wreckage. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and, with patience, courage, and a love as tenacious as the wildflowers at their feet, they had built something new. They had built a home. They had found their honor not in conquest or in wealth, but in the quiet, revolutionary act of healing. And under the vast, indifferent gaze of the western sky, it was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to hear where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let us know. For more tales like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts on the story of Eli and Nietzsche.